We've completed restoration of the Kissimmee River. We've put the meanders back in the river. We've backfilled that canal, and we're already starting to see dramatic habitat and water quality improvement across that Kissimmee Valley.
Welcome to another episode of Rewilding the World with me, Ben Goldsmith. And I am with Steve Davis, my new friend from the Everglades Foundation in Florida. In fact, Steve and I were together not so long ago on an airboat cruising across the great river of grass. And I have to say, not often lost for words, but looking at the Everglades firsthand for the first time really did blow me away. Steve, you're very lucky to work in that extraordinary landscape. Thank you very much for being with me today.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Ben, and it is a spectacular ecosystem and one that I always enjoy visiting.
And the thing I learned first and foremost when I was with you, Steve, is how the Everglades works. I mean, we all know this is a great wetland of huge global significance, but I don't think that many people know actually how it works. So I think that might be a good place to start. Can you just tell me a little bit about how the Everglades functions?
Well, it's a very large wetland ecosystem to begin with, and it's on a very flat and low-sloping peninsula here in South Florida, and it's driven by our seasonal rainfall. And we're fortunate in that we get about 1.5 meters of rainfall every year. Roughly 75% of that falls within our wet season, and that drives the very slow sheet flow of water from north to south, all the way down to Florida Bay, which is near the Florida Keys. And so this is a very large ecosystem that's driven by rainfall and the presence of that clean rainfall water quality. And so this system has grown over about 5,000 years and has evolved into what it is today.
How much of the water that sheets down across the Everglades comes from the northern part of the Florida Panhandle or the states above Florida?
Well, the historic ecosystem originated roughly where Orlando is, so Disney World. And so the rainfall on that part of the state, which is roughly central Florida, would make its way down the spine of the state, down the Kissimmee River Valley into Lake Okeechobee. That's about a 100-mile stretch. And then from there, Lake Okeechobee, this massive 700 square mile lake, would spill over to the south, and that water would flow as a sheet then upwards of 50 miles wide, a distance of about 100 miles all the way down to the tip of the peninsula. So that's how it worked originally, and that was the spatial extent of the ecosystem.
And Lake Okeechobee translates in the language of the Seminole Indians as big water, loosely, is that right?
Exactly. If you were to stand on the edge of Lake Okeechobee, well, you would be on a 35-foot dike looking out over the lake, and you would think you were looking at the ocean. It's a massive body of water. It's not that deep, but it's a very large lake that when it would receive that water from the north, it would naturally spill over to the south. And of course, we've changed that.
Is the lake itself an important ecosystem? I've never visited, but what makes the lake itself special?
Well, the lake historically was an incredible ecosystem as a relatively clear water lake, sandy bottom. Clear water is important because that's what supports the submerged aquatic plants that provide habitat for a variety of fish species, many of which are recreationally important. And then there are a variety of other species that ecosystem supported in its natural pre-impacted state. And of course, again, due to changes in water management, changes in water quality, the health of that lake has deteriorated, especially over the last 50 years.
So when it was still functioning as nature intended, the water would spill out over an area. How big in hectares or acres was the Everglades before the water reached the bottom of the Panhandle?
Today, we have about 3 million acres of that ecosystem remaining, and that's about half of what it was historically. So that gives you some perspective. And part of it was westward development in areas like metropolitan Miami, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm Beach, That developed westward out to the Everglades. And then, of course, carving out a massive drained peatland for agriculture south of the lake, which is roughly 700,000 acres, was a big transformation.
So we're going to talk about that agricultural area beneath Lake Okeechobee and Big Sugar and the impact it's had on the Everglades. Before we do, can you just give me a sense of the natural vibrancy and abundance of that landscape before it was altered? Because what I saw was pretty incredible. I mean, I saw alligators, I saw wading birds, I saw colors of all different kinds. The water seemed incredibly clean. I saw something truly magical. What would I have seen if I'd been in the Everglades a couple of hundred years ago?
I think the most noticeable thing would be more birds. The estimates are that we've lost about 90% of the wading birds that the Everglades historically supported. So for every bird that you see today out there, imagine 10 times that. And there are times of the year now where we see very large concentrations of wading birds because they do forage in large areas. But imagine 10 times that amount.
And what about fish from the sea coming up into the Everglades?
Well, as you get closer to the coast, that fresh water, even today, mixes with salt water around the coastline. And those estuaries are incredibly productive areas for fish and shellfish and even species of marine mammals and sea turtles. So, of course, as fresh water was flowing through that system historically, you would find some of those estuarine species making their way up into the Everglades, even sharks as well.
So what went wrong, Stephen, when? When did the big engineering of the wetland begin, and how far did they get?
Well, some of the earliest cuts to the system were made beginning in the late 1800s, and there were federal incentives at the time to drain swamplands for reclamation, for agriculture, which was obviously an important industry at that time. But the really big transformation took place in the late 1940s with what was called the Central and Southern Florida Project. That's what resulted in the Army Corps of Engineers, the federal agency, becoming engaged in South Florida flood protection and water supplies. And it's that infrastructure that caused so much harm to the ecosystem that we're working now with those same federal partners to adapt to deliver more environmental benefits.
Because the goal at the time was to funnel the water out sideways, right, into the ocean on the east and the west side of the Panhandle, so that it instead didn't flow south as it was meant to through the Everglades.
Exactly. As soon as that project formalized the establishment of that Everglades agricultural area, the water could no longer flow south. There was also a dike that had been constructed in the 1920s around Lake Okeechobee that served as an effective barrier. So with an inability to send that water south, connections were made, artificial connections were made to Florida's east and west coasts, along the St. Lucie River to the east coast and along the Caloosahatchee River to the west coast. So those two outlets became sort of a purging of water as the lake would fill up every wet season. So of course, that was an unnatural volume of water going to those coasts. And so there were impacts associated with that, in addition to the lack of that water going south.
And this engineering served principally to create this 700,000 acre sugar plantation to the south of Lake Okeechobee, right in the path of the sheet of water that was meant to flow down across the River of Grass. And today, as I understand it from our conversations when we were together in Florida, that farmland belongs to two very large corporations, the Florida Crystal Company, which is owned by my friend Pepe Van Hool and his family, and the American Sugar Corporation, which belongs to the Mott family in the Midwest. So that is the agricultural area we're talking about, right?
That is. And today it is predominantly in sugar production. There are some areas that have been acquired for water quality improvement. Part of their water quality impacts We use treatment wetlands to clean up that water. And there are some other areas that are in wildlife management. But for the most part, it is agriculture, and the vast majority of that is sugar production.
So how much water is making it onto the Everglades from Lake Okeechobee, given this great block of sugar that stands between the two?
It varies from year to year, but it's a very tiny fraction of what it was historically. Generally, what the Everglades receives today, aside from rainfall, is the runoff water from those sugar fields. And for decades, that was untreated, polluted water that has had a legacy of impacts within the ecosystem. But today, we have a water quality standard that has to be met before that water is released to the Everglades. But it's really sugar's runoff water that the Everglades receives today, in addition to rainfall.
And the Everglades is a low nutrient ecosystem, a bit like an English wildflower meadow. It relies upon an absence of nitrates and phosphates for its health. So is that sugar runoff water today still too loaded in phosphates and nitrates for the health of the ecosystem?
It is. We're working to remedy that through these treatment wetlands to strip out particularly the phosphorus. The natural Everglades evolved under highly oligotrophic, which is a very low nutrient type of ecosystem like a bog, and it's because they're driven by rainfall. So it's the quality of the rainfall water that dictates the plants and animals that exist there. And of course, when you increase the phosphate levels above the concentrations of rainfall, then you start to see transformations take place. And of course, with the decades of phosphorus levels, 10 to 20 times that you find in rainfall coming in from the north, we've seen some substantial transformation in the Everglades. And we're unsure as to whether we can revert those areas back to their natural habitat.
This episode of Rewilding the World is very kindly brought to you by Uni, that's UNI, the world's first nature-friendly line of luxury body care. We've all heard about the harm that sun cream does to coral reefs, but it's not just sun cream and it's not just coral reefs. Well, Uni makes plastic-free, nature-friendly essentials like shampoo, conditioner, hand wash, and even natural deodorant, all full of nourishing ingredients such as seaweed kelp, aloe vera, and olive oil. We've been loving our Uni products, but don't take it from me. Here's my wife, Jemima.
Yes, I really love them. They're such clean and nourishing products. The microalgae body oil is so good and really smells amazing.
You can find Uni products at Space NK or at weareuni.com. And what about the water that's flowing sideways through those engineered canals, presumably also loaded with phosphates and nitrates? What impact does that have on the sensitive coastal environment on either side of the panhandle?
Incredible impacts. I mentioned earlier that just the volume of those releases of fresh water from Lake Okeechobee to both of those coasts results in harm, because those are estuaries that depend on a balance of fresh and salt water. With too much fresh water, it renders those areas that are supporting oysters and seagrasses, it renders them freshwater ecosystems, and that leads to harm. When you add in the fact that Lake Okeechobee itself is an impaired, polluted water body that often supports toxic cyanobacteria blooms every summer, it extends that polluted freshwater state down to the coastline and just exacerbates those problems with fish kills, toxin-forming species of algae that result in human health concerns, nesting sea turtles, manatees, other species that depend on those estuaries are affected by that.
When we read about the death of manatees in the Florida coastline, how much of that can be attributed to red tides and toxic algal blooms along the coast?
It can absolutely be ascribed to those conditions, but we don't have those conditions every year. So we know that there are, during high red tide events or during those release periods from Lake Okeechobee where we have toxic blue-green algae on both coasts, we see losses of sea turtles washing up on beaches, dead manatees, and they can be in the dozens. but we don't have those conditions every year, fortunately.
Tourism must be one of Florida's biggest earners. How often are conditions such that tourists can't go on the beach or go in the water?
Well, that's one of the biggest issues, and certainly one of our most effective talking points about the need for Everglades restoration is that we are a tourism state. We don't have a state income tax in Florida, and that's largely because of the millions of tourists that come to this state every year. They're not just coming for Disney World. They're coming for our coastline, for our beaches, for our clean water, the habitats, and the very species they support. And so when we see degradation in our water quality, when we see beach closures from red tide or Department of Health notifications that you should avoid any contact with water because of toxic blue-green algae, that has a cascading effect throughout the state because people don't often associate a problem in Fort Myers with what might be going on in the Florida Keys. To them, it's a problem in Florida.
I also read not so long ago that there are moments in the year in which air quality in some of Florida's cities is as bad as you'll find in Mumbai or Delhi or Beijing on account of burning by the sugar growers. Is that still happening?
It is, and I'm not an expert in that area, but to my knowledge, South Florida is one of the few areas globally where that pre-harvest burn is still allowed. Even in countries like Brazil, that has been eliminated. It's an old-fashioned approach to harvesting cane, and it results in the massive plumes of ash that fall on those communities around Lake Okeechobee. And if you try to drive through it, it's like what you would imagine a war zone being.
So it's fair to say that of all the issues facing this great wetland, a huge block of industrial sugar to the south of Lake Okeechobee is by far and away the biggest issue because it forms a blockage preventing the water to flow the way it's meant to down through the river of grass. Instead, the water is pumped sideways out to the coast, and it creates an unacceptable nutrient load, not just for the Everglades itself, but for these sensitive coastlines. Big sugar is the principal issue.
Well, politically, they're a very powerful entity. They lobby in some cases against Everglades restoration. A key project of Everglades restoration is a reservoir that is being built today in that agricultural area on state-owned land that was leased to the sugar industry for cane production. And they're fighting that project in court. That's the most important project for Everglades restoration. So there's also efforts to stall or delay progress with Everglades restoration. We've also looked at the carbon emissions from those fields that are drained for sugar production, and the emissions annually are enormous.
You're listening to Rewilding the World with me, Ben Goldsmith, and this podcast is sponsored by my friends at Vivo Barefoot. I didn't necessarily have it in mind to work with a sponsor on these podcasts, unless it was a brand and a company that I really love, and Vivo Barefoot falls into that category. Until I met Galahad Clark, founder of Vivo Barefoot, it had never occurred to me that the rigid shoes we wear on our feet all day, every day might in fact not be very good for us. Well, with Vivo Barefoot, they figured it out. These are shoes which are flexible and mimic the effect of walking around barefoot. I love mine. I wear them the whole time. I'm a real convert, and I think you will be too. So get a pair at a 15% discount with the code VIVORewilding15, which is valid until the 30th of April 2024. The website is vivobarefoot.com. Read the About section to understand the story better. It's really, really interesting stuff. Why does the state not enforce polluter pays regulation? Like, why is the state responsible for building treatment infrastructure for the dirty water flowing out of the sugar into the Everglades, into the coast? Why is that the responsibility of taxpayers?
Well, part of that is a shortcoming of our Clean Water Act. It has difficulty dealing with non-point sources of pollution. It was very effective at resolving a lot of the industrial pollution that you could point to a pipe and say, that's the source of the problem. We need to clean it up. So dealing with agricultural pollution is something that really is an issue nationwide here in the United States. Think of the Mississippi Valley and the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico as an example of that. But the problem is once that water passes into a state of Florida managed canal or passes through a gate structure that the state's responsible for, then the water quality becomes the state's problem. And so in combination with litigation has led to the need for these massive treatment wetlands that we rely on today to clean up that pollution. They do have a water quality compliance metric that they need to meet for the agricultural area, largely for those sugar fields, but it's a very low bar to clear, and therefore that problem is then passed on to the state and largely the taxpayer.
So just to round off this discussion around sugar, the American taxpayer is paying 4 times over for sugar production in the Everglades. There's a huge subsidy under the federal farm bill for these 2 sugar growers. There's the imposition of tariffs, which raises the price of sugar for all Americans in order to protect these sugar growers from cheaper imports. There's the huge cost to the state of Florida and the federal government of building infrastructure to treat the polluted water coming out of the Everglades. And there's the economic loss associated with red tides and algal blooms and harm done to these ecosystems which draw in all the tourists. What about fresh water? You gave me a water tank, which I still have with me, and it says on it, your water comes from the Everglades. What's the impact of a depleted Everglades ecosystem on fresh water for Floridians?
Well, the Everglades sits on top of a very porous limestone bedrock, and that extends down about 50 to 150 feet in depth to an impenetrable layer of rock. And so everything above that is what's called the Biscayne Aquifer. And the Biscayne Aquifer represents the water supply for all of us who live in South Florida, millions of us. Miami-Dade County alone has nearly 3 million people. Even though half the county is in the Everglades, the other half is a very densely populated area. The same goes for Fort Lauderdale and southern Palm Beach County to the north, the Florida Keys all the way to Key West. They're all umbilically connected to the aquifer under the Everglades. When the Everglades is full, when we have an average to wet year, things are good. We've got plenty of water for everyone, but it's in those dry years where we're not getting that subsidy from Lake Okeechobee from the north, where we run into water supply issues, we run into habitat loss, we run into increased fires. And so all these problems flow from a lack of water, but fundamentally it's our water supply.
Steve, you're the chief scientist at the Everglades Foundation, which is arguably the premier organization working towards Everglades restoration. And the foundation's achieved some pretty amazing things. In spite of the major challenges that the Everglades faces, I saw some pretty dramatic restoration works. What do you think are the best pieces of news coming out of the Everglades right now?
Well, I'll just point to 2 areas. One is that Everglades Agricultural Area Reservoir south of Lake Okeechobee. That is a massive project. That area is about 18,000 acres in size. About 10,000 acres of that will be the footprint for the reservoir that will hold about 240,000 acre feet of water. So that will be a massive storage tank in addition to a treatment wetland of about 6,500 acres next door to it. This footprint is larger than Manhattan. Just to put it into scale, it's about a $3.5 billion project. Will be the largest project that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has ever built in its history. This is the key to Everglades restoration, and this project is now underway. 23 years after it was deemed a critically important project, we're finally seeing progress on that. That project will also help to cut those discharges to the east and west coast by 55%. So that is number one.
And why is that project so great as compared with, for example, using that $3 billion odd to buy out the sugar people and just re-wet and rewild those 500,000 acres of sugar plantations, let the water sheet as it used to. Why is that project necessary? Or to put the question slightly differently, would the project be necessary if sugar farming stopped on that agricultural area and the land was re-wetted?
Well, there are issues with just re-wetting that land because there are communities within that footprint of the agricultural area. So some kind of flood control measure would be needed to protect those communities. And the reality is they're unwilling sellers. They profit from every acre of land they have in production. And so they fight these projects because it takes acreage out of production. And this project in particular, being a key part of that plan that was federally authorized in 2000, signed into law by Bill Clinton, we're working from that plan that we all agreed to at that time. And so moving forward with that project is really our best path forward because it's in a plan that is already congressionally authorized.
So that's going to mean a lot more clean water making its way down to the Everglades. When I was with you in the Everglades, we looked at the Tamiami Trail, that busy road which crosses straight across the Everglades from Tampa to Miami, which formed a second barrier, depriving the southern part of the Everglades even more of the vital water that it needs. That Tamiami Trail is being raised up. I was stood on it with you, and the water was flowing beneath us on a kind of series of bridges under the road. That must have been a very expensive project as well.
Yes, and so that road being built in the 1920s, it really served as the first dam across the River of Grass. And south of Tamiami Trail, you have Everglades National Park, a World Heritage Site, an International Biosphere Reserve of about 1.5 million acres in area. So we knew from the beginning that we needed to get more water across Tamiami Trail. And having now 3.3 miles of bridges, elevated roadway to get more of that water into Everglades National Park is really the plumbing that we needed. And there are some final pieces to that project that are underway right now, but that provides the critical plumbing needed to get water into the park. And it wasn't nearly as expensive as the reservoir. We're talking about, $500 million or so in infrastructure along Tamiami Trail and to the south to ensure that as we're putting more water in the park, we're not flooding communities to the east.
And I guess the third big measure for which the Everglades Foundation has been campaigning for a long time has been restoration along the river to the north of Lake Okeechobee.
The Kissimmee River. And that is another example of the follies and misunderstanding of the past, where the goal was to drain floodplains and wetlands for agriculture. And so they took a 100-mile meandering Kissimmee River and straightened it into about a 50-mile canal. And what that resulted in addition to the drainage of the Kissimmee Valley floodplain, it also resulted in a mainline injection of polluted water directly into Lake Okeechobee. So it certainly contributed to the impacts that we see in Lake today. But we've now completed restoration of the Kissimmee River. We've put the meanders back in the river. We've backfilled that canal, and we're already starting to see dramatic habitat and water quality improvement across that Kissimmee Valley.
So does that mean the whole formerly 100-kilometer river has been re-wiggled and wetlands all along it created? I mean, that's a massive undertaking. That must be the biggest river re-wiggling the world has ever seen.
Well, the entire canal was not removed. There are still areas where water management structures are essential, but it's about a 40-mile stretch of meanders that have been restored. And that's the project that was congressionally authorized. That's the project that's completed. So to your question, no, we've not restored the entire Kissimmee back to what it once was. We have a pretty significant stretch of that has been restored.
And the state is buying land. There's the Florida Wildlife Corridor, for example, which is a mechanism by which the state can either acquire conservation easements or outright freehold ownership over land. What's that about? Is that about expanding wetland habitat? Is that about creating wild corridors for wildlife? Why is Florida buying so much land?
Well, in the corridor itself, it's really to provide a path, a safe path to move wildlife, especially things like the Florida panther, whose numbers were in the tens and 20s just 40, 50 years ago. And we've seen an improvement of those numbers for a variety of reasons, but their populations haven't expanded back to where they once were north of Lake Okeechobee. So acquiring lands that are either in agriculture today or some degree of agricultural land use are being purchased by the state and allowed to restore back to some native habitat so that we can provide those corridors, those paths for panthers and other species to really distribute themselves over a much wider area. The panther itself is habitat limited to the south, and providing more habitat connections to the north, we expect will boost their numbers.
Yeah, the Florida panther is such an interesting story because it's the last population of eastern cougars. Now, the cougar has rebounded and is thriving on the west side of North America, but they struggle to cross because less habitat in the middle of America, and females tend not to disperse very well anywhere. Lots of hunters with guns who want to kill them in the Midwestern states and so on. And the northeast of North America is desperately in need of an apex predator. White-tailed deer numbers are exploding and hollowing out the recovering forests, causing all kinds of havoc in the roads, road traffic accidents, problems with Lyme disease and chronic wasting of deer and so on. They really need an apex predator. And if the Florida wildlife corridor can be established such that Florida panthers can expand back up to the north of the Panhandle and maybe even into the great wetland of southern Georgia, if we get cougars or Florida panthers back as far north as the Okefenokee wetland, then it's easy to imagine them moving up the Appalachians and into the northeast. Is that right?
Exactly. And just talking about the Florida panther itself, their numbers were in the 10s and 20s, and the state imported a handful of female cougars from Texas. Very similar genetic composition, but different enough to introduce new genetic material to a population that was in a bottleneck and was experiencing diseases related to that. So if we can see expansion of these numbers, especially to the north, then these Florida panthers could potentially serve as seed populations elsewhere where those cougars and panthers once existed.
You told me also when we met that the saltwater crocodiles, the American crocodiles that live in the coastal areas of the Everglades, have rebounded from near extinction. That's pretty cool, Steve. How did that come about?
Well, it's been a combination of factors that's led to the recovery of the American crocodile. One is that we're starting to see increased freshwater flow to the coast, and they prefer salty areas around the tip of the Florida Peninsula, but their northward distribution is limited by cold. They are more of a subtropical, tropical species. So areas that experience frequent frost, central Florida to the north, you don't find them any further north. So they were really restricted to South Florida and dependent upon those estuarine salinities, needing that freshwater flow because the juveniles depend on those conditions in order to survive. But one of the other things that we've seen in areas along a nuclear power generating facility that has very large cooling canals is that became a sort of refuge for the American crocodile when their numbers were quite low, and they were nesting in large numbers along those canals, and that's helped to really keep that population sufficient enough to where they can now benefit from Everglades restoration around much more of the coast.
And the species which are less welcome have also proliferated in recent years. The Burmese python, and in fact, someone once said to me that almost anything can live or grow in the Everglades, and there's a proliferation of invasive species. Resilient ecosystems tend to resist better the expansion of invasive species. So do you think the restoration work that is now being undertaken in the Everglades will help the ecosystem to cope with this influx of Burmese pythons and other invasive species?
I think resilience is a great way to describe it. The system at present is suffering from a lack of water, polluted water, and so these novel habitats that have been formed within the system provide refuge for these exotic invasives to become established. And in fact, many of the areas where we find some of the more problematic species, and the python is a great example, are in areas of Everglades National Park that have been overdrained. And they are benefiting from that. And other species that don't have native predators or competitors are proliferating. And so we do think that Everglades restoration will improve the ability of this system to fend off those types of invasions. But at the same time, we are realistic in our understanding that it's not going to get rid of them. We will continue to manage these species to our best ability well into the future, because just like people enjoy the conditions in South Florida, non-native species that are introduced really proliferate here because of the mild climate and the abundance of water.
Steve, I could talk to you for so much longer than this podcast. You're a fountain of knowledge and empathy and love for nature. You love your job so much, and it's just awesome what you do. We've really barely scratched the surface. We didn't even have time to talk about your fascinating personal backstory, but I hope you'll come on the podcast again. And I hope more than anything that something changes in the US such that Florida brings to an end industrial sugar growing south of Lake Okeechobee. All it needs is an end to subsidies under the Farm Bill, or it needs properly enforced polluter pays legislation, or it needs the removal of tariffs in which Brazilian and other imported sugar can compete fairly in an open market, and sugar will no longer be the predominant activity, and that land can become part of the Everglades again. That seems to me the biggest part of the story. But the Everglades Foundation is doing awesome work, and it was amazing for me to see it, and I'm so grateful to you. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Ben. It's great being on with you.
If you happen to find yourself in the southeast of the United States, I really urge you to go and see the Florida Everglades. You'll be blown away. The scale of it, the wilds like you've never seen. And Steve and his team are doing magnificent work there at the Everglades Foundation. If you've enjoyed the episode, please do us a favor and go to whichever platform you use to get your podcasts. Give us a like, maybe a review, spread the word among your friends. It all makes a big difference, and we're truly grateful. With special thanks to my friends at Vivo Barefoot for sponsoring this podcast. Vivo Barefoot is revolutionizing footwear and our connection with the earth. You can find more information and a discount code for your own pair of Vivo Barefoot shoes in the notes that accompany this podcast. Next time, I'm going to be talking to Melpo Apostolidou, who works for BirdLife and is engaged in the restoration of griffon vultures in the island of Cyprus. They literally bring them in wooden crates from Spain and let them go on the cliffs, and it's working. Melpo is a star. I do hope you'll join us.
You already know that this isn't about one species. It's about systems, interdependence, collapse. And yet, wild salmon, one of the clearest indicators we have, are vanishing fast. Their decline signals something deeper, something more dangerous. I'm Jim Murray. I host The Last Salmon. It's not a side story. It's the biodiversity story that everyone like you should be listening to. Season 2's out now.
One of the best ways to support rewilding is to go and visit rewilding projects on the ground. My friends at the European Nature Trust have asked me to tell you about the series of coexistence adventures that they've put together. They're designed to give you the best chance of seeing Europe's most iconic species: bears, wolves, lynx, and so on. All of these are on the rise in Europe because of rewilding projects. These trips are hosted by expert guides and conservationists, and most importantly, the European Nature Trust is giving half of the revenues directly to the foundations working on the ground to restore wildlife. I'd love you to check out these coexistence adventures at the European Nature Trust website.